This is Scott Becker with the Becker Private Equity Podcast. We're joined today by one of the most brilliant lawyers that I know. We're joined by David Pivnick, and we're going to talk to David today about there's been the most active Department of Justice and Healthcare that I've seen in literally about a decade or so. More false claims cases, more whistleblower cases, more Department of Justice involved than we've seen in a long time. It seems like it took a couple years into the Biden administration, but the DOJ seems like it's really ramped up. David, what does that mean for healthcare companies, for health systems, for private equity investors in healthcare? How do you measure this? How do you look at that? And what does it all mean?
Yeah, I mean, the measuring it is kind of hard. In terms of the what does it mean, I think there's a few key takeaways. I think the first thing and the most important thing is it's a really good reminder and teaching point of the importance of being diligent and conscientious in terms of your operations, having a robust compliance plan, making sure that you actually adhere to the compliance plan and that it's sort of active and being utilized. It's a good reminder that things like periodic auditing of claims submission, doing it internally, but also maybe annual reviews by a third party or quarterly reviews, depending on the size of the operation. I think it's a good reminder of the need to be really, really diligent and conscientious about compliance and recognizing that healthcare is an incredibly highly regulated industry and it's subject to a lot of scrutiny, and where the DOJ is being very active right now. The reality is most DOJ investigations in the fraud arena are dealing with healthcare. It's typically about 2/3 of all active fraud investigations and settlements and judgments are arising out of healthcare. So to me, more than anything else, it's a function of the need to be careful and to run a good business. And then day to day, it means treating patients as individuals, not just having rules of the road or billing and coding that's one size fits all for all patients who are being seen, et cetera. Instead, you need to make sure you're treating the individual patients based on their actual conditions and needs, and then billing appropriately for the care that's rendered. So I think there's a lot of good reminders. The other thing that I think is important to keep in mind is that investigations are going to be coming. And 10 years ago, I think there was a bit of a view, if a healthcare entity got a civil investigative demand from the DOJ or a subpoena and was aware of an audit or an investigation, I think a lot of people viewed it sort of right off the bat that the sky was falling and a business couldn't go to market. Any transactions would be held up. They had to worry about the solvency, et cetera. And I think there was a real perception that the fact of the investigation without more was reflective of there being problems. And I just don't think that's the case right now. I think there's a lot of healthcare entities out there that are investigated where there's simply nothing wrong. There's no wrongdoing. A whistleblower misinterpreted the law and brought a claim. A whistleblower didn't understand the facts. They thought, a compensation scheme said X or an arrangement said X when actually it was Y. And so I think there's a lot to be said now of taking things a bit more in stride, being prepared if the government comes knocking, having a plan in place on what to do if an FBI agent or OIG agent shows up to serve process, but understanding that service alone is not the end of the world, that there's pathways to work through the investigation and to continue operations notwithstanding those concerns. And I think that's a big mindset shift that I think is important these days and wasn't necessarily common a decade ago, but I think clients now have a much more realistic understanding that if they're operating in the current environment and they're doing well in the healthcare space, there's a decent chance they're going to have to deal with an investigation at some point, and that just doesn't mean anything incorrect or improper took place.
Thank you. And is your sense that it's a much more active DOJ than it's been in some time? Is that your sense as well?
I think active is relative. I think that there are probably more overall cases right now, in large part because I think there are a lot of investigations that took a long time during COVID, and some of which were largely paused in 2020 and 2021, where they're now still being worked by the DOJ, a few years later. So, if you look at the raw number of key TAMs that are filed year over year, I don't think it's busier today than it was a handful of years ago. But if considering that metric, more in terms of how many active files are on a given DOJ attorney's desk, I think that there probably is a little bit more activity right now. And I think it's sort of a problem that's compounded, where some of those investigations were necessarily slowed down due to the pandemic, and very much understandably so. And now the DOJ attorneys are making up for that because they have a backlog that they have to address from several years ago, in addition to the steady volume of cases coming in.
Thank you. And that makes a lot of sense. So the core advice to health systems, to private equity investors in healthcare, to healthcare companies, the core advice. Give us that core advice again.
Core advice, understand that in this regulatory environment, there's a very real chance that you're going to be subject to a government inquiry at some point, whether it's a formal investigation, a RAC audit, or other form of audit, or other inquiry. And so being prepared, having part of the compliance plan addressing what happens if an audit request comes in, what happens if a government agent shows up, who should that get routed to, how will it be handled, how is communication going to be addressed? That's point one. I think you need to plan as if there's a risk that it's going to happen, and have that plan in place so that people understand what they're supposed to do if the government shows up, and how to handle that appropriately. Two, have a robust compliance plan, and robust, is going to vary. A 3-person physician practice, primary care practice, is going to have a very different looking compliance plan versus a health system. But having a compliance plan in place, making sure it's appropriate for the size of the business, and making sure that it's followed is important. And that means doing compliance reviews periodically to make sure the plan's in place. And then I think the third thing is periodic and recurrent monitoring. And some of that could be auditing, both self-auditing and retaining third-party auditors to come in and check billing and coding. I think it means looking at benchmarks, checking how your coding distribution compares to peers in the industry. And, being an outlier is not in and of itself an indication of any wrongdoing. But certainly if you notice that you're a significant outlier in a given, on a given code or a given treatment, it's worth understanding if there's a reason why you're an outlier. And then doing reviews, not just of the compliance, but, where you should have reporting mechanisms as part of a good compliance program, and actually running concerns to ground, doing investigations, making sure that any concerns are taken seriously and addressed, is all going to be very important, and will serve companies well, both in protecting against, issues actually arising, so avoiding actual problems, but also, frankly, it's very helpful in being able to put together a compelling response if and when an issue does arise, where you're able to then explain going forward to the government, here's how we've handled these issues in the past, here's how we run our business. So I think that's all very important and helpful.
David, I want to thank you for joining us again on the Becker Private Equity Podcast. Fascinating perspective. Thank you very much for joining us. Very much. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Scott.